Well, we want to thank everybody for being with us today. I'm Gail Luxenberg, and this is the fourth in a series of conversations that we're having with on behalf of the Chicago Booth Alumni Club on how COVID and social upheaval are impacting our lives. And the Chicago Booth Alumni Club, our mission is to keep Booth area alum connected in what is a disconnected world. I also want to give a shout out to the Rustandi Center and the bank program, Booth Alumni for Nonprofit Consultants, who we've also worked in conjunction with. Today, the guest is Fritz Kaegi, our Cook County Assessor. And the conversation is going to be about structural issues in property valuations and how it creates social inequities. Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi is working to combat the inequitable burden on Cook County residents using a data-driven approach, something that resonates with this audience. So before we start, let me tell you a little bit about Fritz. Fritz is a Cook County Assessor and elected executive office that values most real estate in the US's second largest county. Cook County is the second largest county in the country. He was inducted into the office in December of 2018. At the time, the Chicago Tribune editorial board called his election a rare toppling of the machine. Fritz's campaign focused on making this office ethical, transparent, and fair through the better use of data, modern valuation techniques, and a commitment to stewardship. In the primary, he won the endorsement of 6 Democratic congressmen and defeated the incumbent and chair of the party. In the November general election, he won 1.3 million votes and 76% of the vote. That was a lifetime ago in 2018. Fritz, before taking on this role, was an experienced global small and mid-cap investor, having been senior portfolio manager of the US-focused $5 billion Columbia Acorn Fund and the Columbia Emerging Markets Fund, and an analyst covering those markets. And for those of you who don't know, the Acorn Fund was founded here by Booth folks. He was also at Morningstar's Equity Research Group. He was raised in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood, where his dad was a professor for 52 years of Byzantine history in the college at the University of Chicago. And he's a graduate of the Kenwood Academy. He majored in political science and economics at Haverford. And after working in Russia, he received his MBA from the Stanford Business School. In 2001, Fritz returned to Chicago. He's also a partner at Social Venture Partners, a philanthropic organization committed to social change and poverty reduction. So welcome, Fritz.
Thanks, Gail. I really appreciate the introduction, and glad to have Booth people here who I consider, even though I never went to Booth, I consider them my people because I grew up around Booth people my whole life. In high school, while I was at Kenwood, I took a class at the U of C with Marvin Zonas, political economy class, and he became a beloved professor at Booth. The founders of the firm where I grew up, both at Columbia Wenger Asset Management, the Acorn Fund, it came out of Booth, and the Center for Research on Security Prices, and Irving Harris was the chairman of the board for a long time. And my predecessor, Charles McQuaid, he's endowed a professorship at Booth. Lubos Pastor is the professor who holds that position now. And many of the trustees of the Acorn Fund, like Steve Kaplan and Laura Bourne and John Heaton, teach at Booth today. Not to mention the fact when I worked at Morningstar, also created by an illustrious U of C alum, Joe Mansueto. So even though it never went to Booth, love it. And of course, the other thing I wanted to mention is that I did a lot of our recruiting for Columbia Wenger at booth, and so feel like I'm very jealous of you guys. You know, when I was back when it was called the GSB, you know, I spent a lot of time hanging out at Rosenwald, and the building you have at Booth now is terrific, and so I'm just tickled to be
Maybe I saw you getting coffee down in Rosenwald. They had the best coffee on campus.
here.
And,
Yes.
and I do want to just underline that there's now been 3 of us who mentioned that Marvin Zonis was instrumental in our business careers. And Marvin was my advisor when I was a Middle Eastern Studies graduate with my undergraduate degree. So nice to have those connections. Bona
Love Marvin.
fides are established, and now we're going to jump in. So
Great.
with that background, why did you decide to run for elected office in the 2nd largest county in the country collecting taxes?
Well, basically, you know, what our office, what the Cook County Assessor's office is it's basically, you know, it determines the fairness of our property tax system. It is really about equity. And when it's malfunctioning, it can do great economic damage, especially if it's tethered to, you know, political ends, which are not good. And not only can do economic damage to neighborhoods, to people, to families, and you know, being leveraged for bad political ends, but also hurts our reputation when people hear that that our system of property taxation and it is not transparent, it's inequitable. You know, when I was running, The Economist magazine actually wrote an article about our campaign. And you know, when the writer, we didn't think the article would make it into The Economist, and but when it did, we asked the writer, "How did this happen?" And she said, you know, her editor said that this is what people around the world want to read about Chicago, and therein lies the problem. So. And as I learned about this system, you know, I really enjoyed investing and I loved the work that I did. But as a pastime, I'd read about what was going on in our politics and our local economy here in Chicago. And I just knew that this office is basically about valuing properties and using, basically, it's supposed to be a mirror to the market in reflect, if we can put a market price on every building, that determines that building's share of a $15 billion tax levy that has to be paid every year. And if it's distorted, then some people pay more of their fair share than others. And as someone who grew up as a, you know, trained as a financial expert and as an analyst, it really bothered me that the valuation process was being distorted for bad ends that had bad impacts, and that through better valuation techniques, through better transparency, through better stewardship, resisting the pressure for favoritism and favorable treatment, you could have a tax system that'd be more fair, more equitable for everyone, wouldn't do as much economic damage, would help improve the reputation of the city and region that I love and grew up in. And it's an executive office where these changes can be driven. We don't have to wait for the planets to align in Washington or Springfield to get a lot of this work done. So I like the idea that, you know, we can have a real impact here with a mandate from the voters. And thank goodness we did.
Great. So we want to drill down a little because nobody
Sure.
would argue with those premises.
Yeah.
They're pretty universal. So just to be clear, your office handles both commercial and residential properties?
That's right. So we're the 2nd largest county in the country, but we're actually the largest jurisdiction in the country that uses market values in assessment of properties and its property tax system. LA is larger than Chicago, but than Cook County, but LA has Prop 13, where they just assess properties based on what they were purchased at, no matter how long ago that was, no matter how much properties might have appreciated. So our job is really to be on top of the market now, and we assess all different kinds of properties that are sort of non-governmental in nature. So if it's a warehouse, if it's a mall, if it's an office building, if it's a manufacturing plant, an apartment building, condo, single family house, stadium, if it's privately owned, these are the things that we need to put a market value on so that everyone's paying their fair. Everyone is valued at a proper market price, so that everyone is paying their fair share of the property tax system. The key is that the valuations be consistent, and no favor given or valuation gap exists, so that some pay less than others.
Great. So I want to drill down specifically in the homeownership area. It's an
Sure.
area of special interest to me. I was the CEO of the Habitat in Seattle, and so I learned a lot about how home ownership changes people's lives. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, home ownership is really the jumping off point to build wealth for a family.
Yes.
And I learned that while doing that job, that renters who move often, their kids lose 7 months of school learning every time they make a move. So moving frequently is really a hardship on kids' educational achievement. And I also learned that average renters have about $5,000 in assets, and average homeowners have anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 in assets. So we've heard a lot about how redlining kept the Black community out of certain neighborhoods through lending practices. Has tax assessment worked as a structural issue that has also created those same inequities?
Yes, and actually there are a couple different layers of what we call regressivity to that. So basically, regressivity is when the more modest your home is in value, the higher a rate it tends to pay, which is not supposed to be the way it works. The way it works is if you live in a community, you own a $10,000 home, $100,000 home, $1 million home, $10 million home, the rate should be the same because it should be reflecting what the market value of all these things is. The problem is that data measurement, data modeling, valuation modeling has tended to assign values for those $10,000 homes that are higher and generate a higher rate than the really high ticket homes. And there's a racial pattern to this too. Several different third-party studies have found that Black homes tend to pay a higher effective rate. And this is not only true in Cook County, but this is true in many parts of the United States. There have been many different, very rigorous studies on this. And that should not be happening. And there are a couple different reasons why this can happen. Every property tax system or assessment system is a little bit different. There have been historical instances where people found that it was intentionally done this way to strip wealth from minority communities. There are lots of examples of that have been found in the South. That it started like right after Reconstruction. But in the way we see it in Cook County is that, first of all, for a long time, things like foreclosures weren't taken into account in valuing all the properties around them. And we know that the existence of foreclosures can have an impact on the value of homes around them. So that's one example of how you could have assessments that are, and there are many Black communities in Chicago and the suburbs where foreclosure instances are quite high, where a lot of the homes are underwater in terms of mortgages being higher than the value of the homes. So that can create regressivity. And then at the high end, really expensive homes, assessment systems sometimes have trouble capturing all the things that drive value for these higher end homes. That if you're just valuing things on a per square foot basis, you might be missing the effect that's created by a really luxurious mansion that someone would be willing to pay up for, or you're missing some geographic effect of being on a lake with a nice view or something. So these are things that we can do through better modeling valuation techniques and eliminate that regressivity. But there's actually an even deeper instance of unfairness in all of this, Gail. First of all, if we're a mirror to the market, even if our assessments are perfect, all of the distortions from things like redlining can be reflected in assessments. So just because an assessment is accurately capturing depressed home values because of redlining, that doesn't mean that the property tax system is fair. It can still be very regressive because those folks may end up having to pay higher rates. And what we see in the south suburbs of Chicago, and some of the western suburbs too, is the way our property tax system works in Illinois is that communities have to carry most of the freight for paying for their schools. And they have something that's called a levy. It's a lump sum of dollars that has to carry the cost of local services. And if a community has to carry the fixed cost of educating kids and providing local services, but it has no or very little property value in it, even if everyone agrees on the valuations, the rates are going to be naturally much higher. You're dividing that levy by a small base. And so in Cook County, we see communities that have effective rates that are 4 or 5 times the rates in the rest of the county. So if you live in a place like Harvey or some other south suburbs, the effective rate on your property can be 7, 8, 9, 10% of the market value of your home. And just imagine how destructive that is to the ability to compound wealth, Gail. If that's like a super high, that's like like owning a super high cost mutual fund where the fees are like 3 or 4% when the underlying asset class might not grow that much. It'll eat up all your ability to compound. I think we've seen a lot of instances like this in many communities in Cook County, and that's not a function of assessments. That's a function of how things like schools are financed. And that's like a deeper unfairness in the property tax system. We can talk more about this. Is how we can talk about how we fix the funding mechanisms for things like that so that we get rates that converge. Because you make such a good point, Gail. When people are building wealth, typically the first stage in building wealth beyond like just getting the dollars in their bank account is home equity. But imagine you're just getting a toehold in building savings and building wealth, and you ended up doing that in Harvey. It will destroy your ability to compound your wealth if you've been trapped in a situation like that through no fault of your own. You're a victim of how overall housing values eroded the tax base in your community, and you end up paying a high rate. There are lots and lots of people who, in their when they're paying their mortgages, the property tax is higher than the interest on their mortgage and the principal amortization. That's how a malfunctioning system can destroy the wealth creation process that's so important that you talked about, Gail.
So Fritz, when you decided to run for office right before the Tribune did an important study, and it was called An Unfair Burden, their 2017 study, gave some examples from North Lawndale and Little Village to Calumet City and Melrose Park. Residents in working class neighborhoods were more likely to receive property tax bills that assume their homes were worth more than their true market value. Meanwhile, living in the country's wealthiest and most white communities, Winnetka, Glencoe, Lakeview, the Gold Coast, they all caught a break because the property taxes weren't based on the full value of their homes. So you talked a little bit about, you mentioned many different mechanisms of how we got there. What about the appeals process, the tax appeals process, and the ability to hire lawyers to go and fight your tax bill?
Sure. So there are many different mechanisms that create the regressivity that I was talking about. So if you can imagine the assessment system, if it's working perfectly, it's a perfect mirror to the market. So then every property, your share of the total base is your share of the total market value in your community. But if you have, there are several different processes that can make it more regressive. One is what I mentioned, that you have data gaps or valuation errors or biases that tend to overvalue more modest properties and tend to undervalue higher value properties. But then a whole other process can intervene, which is appeals. So what the appeals process does is you can say, hey, I don't think this value, the valuation that you put on my property is accurate for X, Y, and Z reasons. So, you should value my property in a different way. And then what can happen sometimes is that if the assessment system has not been efficient, and if it makes one error, you can sort of cherry pick the low error, and then everyone gets marked, or the people who are appealing get marked down to that. They whittle away their share of the pie at the expense of everyone else. Because remember, there's a lump sum of dollars that has to be divided amongst all of the property owners. If you are appealing and you're diminishing your share of the pie, that comes at everyone else's expense because they have to pay more of that levy after you've whittled down your value in the numerator against the denominator, which is everyone's property value. And then the way things work in Illinois, you have several different bites at the apple. There were several different venues to appeal at our office before we came in. Then you could appeal at 3 other different venues to whittle it down further. Now, what tends to happen is that the people who have the highest value properties tend to be catered to the most in the system. The people who make money off of appeals, which are property tax appeals lawyers, appraisers, the best bang for the buck for them is to cater to the highest value properties, which tend to be the wealthiest. And then wealthiest people tend to be most savvy in navigating systems like this. And then if you add further on, if there's an element of favoritism or coziness between lawyers and the assessment folks, that can further whittle down the share of folks who are working this system at the expense of everyone else. And so what every study has shown is that the more appeals you get, the more regressive the system gets. And we have, we're kind of a grotesque anomaly here in Cook County, where you have quite a high proportion of people appealing, whereas in most other large jurisdictions in the US, it's a small single-digit percentage who do. And so there's emerged this large industry that sort of caters to the system that drives inequity. The only way to really solve this is to make sure you get valuations right the first time. And then you have really good evidence to back up what you're doing so it doesn't get whittled away in the process. The other key is not to be cozy with the people who drive these appeals, and to have robust justifications for the way you're coming up with it. So this is why we emphasize transparent, fair, and ethical. All these things will make the system less regressive.
Okay, I want to make sure that I've asked you all the questions so we have a shared understanding of what the problem is and how we have the data. Before we move forward and I switch the question to how we're going to fix it, is there anything else we need to cover before we switch the conversation to what the future is going to be?
Sure. Well, if you think about like the whole property tax base, sort of the base of assessed value in Cook County, or let's just look at Chicago itself. Within single family homes, we already talked about some of the errors that can create regressivity there. That there are all sorts of data gaps and valuation biases that can cause regressivity in the single family homes. But there's a whole other species of property, which is commercial and industrial property. And a lot of studies, there was just a study published by the Gold Standard in assessments of Cook County, and it showed that in the city of Chicago, commercial properties were 49% underassessed in 2018 based on properties that transacted in 2018. And in the county itself, about 40% underassessed. And so that result sort of shows that, okay, commercial was paying less of its freight than it should have, and that came at the expense of residential homeowners. And then there was another problem when this group, the IAAO, they looked inside the commercial assessments. They saw not only were commercial properties undervalued, but the small commercial properties also were hurt by regressivity within commercial. So the smaller your commercial property, the more likely you were to be valued at the mark-to-market or at a higher level. But as the property got bigger, the more likely it was even to be more and more and more underassessed. So small properties were picking up the tab for larger properties. The third thing the study found was that properties in outlying neighborhoods of the city tended to be valued at a higher level than ones downtown. So again, small properties and neighborhoods funding, picking up the tab for larger properties downtown. So there are many different layers of the inequity that we talked about. And we can talk about how we fix that too.
This can be a long conversation, Fritz, because we haven't even put the COVID equation into the mix yet. So the city knows, the Cook County knows that they need to raise so much money. And if you squeeze the balloon in one place and lessen the burden, then it's going to show up in another place. So given that there's so much structure that exists to keep the interests where they are today, how do you start making change in the system in order to get it more equitable?
Sure. So I think we need to think about two different kinds of forces. There's things that we can directly control in our assessments. So there's assessment fixes and reforms that can be done, but then there's also a deeper matter of what is determining the total amount of dollars that have to be raised. Can we change that? That's what I call levies. So let's talk about first on the assessment side of the equation. The fixes are manifold. First of all, better data, because the gaps in our data tend to create some of these disparities. We talked about the gaps in data leading to disparities on residential assessments. Well, getting better data, which means going out in the field, making sure you properly measured homes, that you're measuring all of the factors that drive home valuation in the best way. That is a really key thing to reducing the regressivity there to make it more equitable. So better data. With that also goes better modeling. So we created a data science department, bringing in folks who've been trained at places like the Harris School. And we put our code online. We put our whole valuation code online so people could see how we're doing it. We think that builds faith in the system. It also helps us discover errors. It's being totally transparent. It also, when people in the assessor's office know that you can't hide how you're coming up with the numbers, that's going to make you more accountable. So that transparency of modeling and valuation technique goes hand in hand with better data. Third of all, you got to really focus on getting it right the first time, because if you depend on appeals to get better data, you're just going to make the system more inequitable. So the rigorous focus on getting things right the first time, very important. Building up evidence supporting our case, very important. And then making sure we're aware of all the different factors. Sometimes there are factors that affect value that we didn't think about or aware of. We've been looking a lot at flooding risk because of climate change. It's increasing the prevalence of flooding in some areas that can be really destructive. And you have to get a special kind of insurance if you live in a flood zone that's federally determined and mapped. So that's the kind of thing you can do on the residential side. On the commercial side, a lot of it is better data. So again, the gaps that we have in our data tend to create these disparities. So on the smaller properties tend to be less profitable. And if we're using third-party data to value them, third-party data may completely miss out what's going on in Englewood or Ingage Park or Marquette Park. So getting good granular data about going on in those neighborhoods is really key. So we worked on a bill in Springfield to require disclosure of basic rent and expense information for buildings, as is done in most of our peer states, so that we could really see what average rent and occupancies are in these smaller commercial properties in neighborhoods that might not be reflected in the commercial databases that we use. But also, we want to make sure that we are properly capturing all the value drivers of the really big buildings. And we have pretty good data for that. We also need to make sure our modeling reflects market levels. We found when we came into this office that there were valuation multiples being used by the assessor's office, which no one in the market could understand or observe. People were assuming you could get a 16% cap rate on a personal storage facility when I ran the Acorn Fund, we would see the market value in these things in mid single digits at most. So that can mean you're really undervaluing that kind of property. Ditto for things like data centers and apartment buildings and other things. You got to make sure you're looking at market multiples and using them, putting yourselves in the shoes of someone in the market on the commercial property. So these are the kinds of things you do to make sure that commercial is being valued fairly and equitably. The last thing is making sure we eliminate conflicts of interest and favoritism that's built into processes. So we eliminated any kind of campaign that could be coming people who practice before the office. We created a visitor's log so that it's perfectly transparent. People in the office that there's no kind of taking advantage of in our office to whittle down their share each year. So those are the kinds of things we can do on the assessment side. But that levy side, how we finance schools. So 2/3 of property taxes are for schools. 2/3 of property tax levies are for schools. So how education is financed in the state explains why property taxes are so high in Cook County and Illinois. Our state is number 50, dead last in the United States, for supporting the funding of K through 12 schools. About 25% of the school district budget is covered by the state. In most other states, be closer to 50%. So what happens as a result of that? The local district has to load on all those additional costs onto the property owner. There's no free lunch here to pay for a school district. If it's not from state support, then they will use the property tax levy to tax local property owners. And that's how we get these distortions that I mentioned, where some South suburban communities that have very little property value to speak of have such incredibly high rates that can kill wealth compared to the rest of the county. How do we fix that? The key is finding other funding sources for schools. So if you get more funding at the state level, every dollar that comes from the state is actually going to reduce the levy in a school district. Why? School districts don't pass property tax rates. They're levies. The levy is like the gap between their budget and their other sources coming from the state and federal. So the more money that comes from state and federal into a school district is one less dollar that has to come through a levy. And this is really important that, I think it's more important than ever that we re-examine how we are financing education in the state, because you were talking about COVID. It's become a commonplace that COVID is accelerating economic trends that were already in place. We know that there has been a tendency for e-commerce to eat away at retail space, malls,
Yes.
Street level stores. This is also happening in office space. Here we are Zooming.
Oh, yes.
People are everywhere are Zooming. Sure, people are going to go back to the offices. Offices are more productive places to work. You get better collaboration. You have meetings, meet new people. But there's going to be a downward trend in the demand for office space. And our economy is generating more and more wealth in ways that don't really require brick and mortar. My old job of investment management, of managing mutual funds, you can generate a lot of income, but you don't need much bricks and mortar for that business. And imagine other businesses like that in Chicago and Illinois are growing, and they don't need much brick and mortar. And yet the whole brick and mortar economy has to carry the cost of our education system. So it's just more and more out of step with reality. It is better to fund more of the cost of education through the kind of taxation that doesn't depend on taxing brick and mortar wealth. You should be taxing incomes to support more of these costs. And so that's what the debate is about today at the state level with the fair tax. We have this fair tax amendment up for vote soon. And the advocates for the fair tax, they point to the fact that this will help us generate more revenues for schools if we use the fair tax. And then we don't need to lean so heavily on property taxes to finance schools. That's one argument. Other people would argue that the state has been really a fiscal disaster, and how can you give the right to do progressive taxation when they've not proven themselves to be responsible for it? So that's the debate there. Other thing that I focus on is federal government can also provide more support for K through 12 schools. They do this through something called Title I. In Chicago, about 10%, so about $300 million goes to Chicago public schools from Title I. It hasn't changed in a decade. Title I is a share of government spending, and GDP has declined since LBJ was president. That's when they created Title I. But they really need to re-examine this, because that's how you can get more equity. Federal government is really in the best position to tax incomes. They don't spend much on Title I. They spend about $15 billion, which is about the cost of one Gerald Ford class aircraft carrier. If they just doubled Title I spending, it could lead to a 10% decline in the need to levy in the CPS. The CPS levies about $3 billion now. They get $300 million in Title I, double Title I. That's less money that they need to levy on this narrowing, slender base of a brick and mortar that supports, the really important social need, which is educating children. So long answer to a good question.
And I think you covered many of the questions that are coming in, but I want to ask you a few that is coming through the chat. So Bruce Dockerman has asked, when you took office, was the situation in the assessor's office as bad or worse than you thought? And what were the key deficiencies?
Well, the sad thing is we won the primary in March of 2018, and then we were to take office in December of 2018. We got zero help from the outgoing administration. They didn't give us one piece of information or access to things to help prepare us for that. Fortunately, we had a lot of time on our transition to prepare, talk to other assessors' offices around the country to get a sense of best practices, build a team of people who could land. But we didn't really know what we'd find until we got there, and it was really bad. There's not a proper org chart. Most of the processes were based on paper. We're all University of Chicago alums, so we have a special appreciation of Indiana Jones. You'll remember at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, you had this warehouse scene where they hid the Ark amidst all these piles of boxes. That was the 9th floor of the assessor's office, a 1 square block of downtown Chicago with boxes piled to the ceiling, no sprinklers, full of paper. That was just 1 year's worth of appeals. We had a conference of assessment professionals taking place in Chicago that December of 2018 when we came in, and I brought in a person who's an assessor in one of the largest assessment jurisdictions in the US, in Texas. And I wanted to show him this. And he took out his camera and he called his friends back home. He said, "Hey, y'all, look at this." because they hadn't seen anything like this since the 80s. So there were a lot of paper processes in place. The folks who lived in the county had, learned through generations to distrust the process. And all those boxes of paper were kind of like a physical manifestation of what was wrong with the system. Too many appeals, distrust, too much paper, valuable data trapped in there. So we put in a lot of technology that we launched actually February of this year. We're lucky we did. So we put in place online appeals, online exemptions, a commercial data portal, a whole new website, call center. And if we hadn't had any of those in place in February, when COVID hit, we would have been dead. We also found that there were good professionals at the assessor's office that continued to work there, but they had been disrespected by the leadership of the previous administration and ignored, so that it really hurt their morale. There'd been no investment in training whatsoever. Staffing levels had deteriorated dramatically. There were something like over 100 people who had credentials from the National Credential Organization in Assessments, called the IAAO, 10 or 15 years ago. But by the time we came in, it had been less than 25 people who had those credentials. So we've really had to amp up training, had to build up data. A lot of the field work that goes into measuring buildings, that's some of the basic data that goes on what we do hadn't been done for a long time, right? It was using a mainframe, green screen technology. So there are a lot of things that we inherited that started off at a really low level. We've traveled quite a long way in the last 2 years. It's fortunate that we have this nice tailwind of technology that we can draw upon. We can draw upon this roadmap of what our peers in the rest of the country have done. But it takes time to change an organization as big as ours. But we've really traveled quite a long way, and the data bears us out on that. We reassessed the north suburbs last year. It was our first third of the county that we fully reassessed. And the data show that we got much more accurate. We reduced the regressivity, both on the residential side and commercial side. There's still a lot of persisting old behavior from lots of appeal and appeals bodies that we don't control use valuation methods that tend to build in favoritism for some kinds of property, and so we'll have to keep on working and addressing that. But we traveled quite a long way last year, and now with COVID this year, we're trying the effects of COVID into the market values of all the different properties. We're the first jurisdiction in the U.S. to do this.
Fritz, I know we're running out of time, and there were many questions. Some people thanking you for all your work that you've done. You're a rock star. Lots of specific questions about their own properties and the valuation. We could have another hour or two, but I know we're getting ready to close up on our time. And I just want to say, on behalf of everyone listening to this, we want to thank you for the work that your office is doing, not only for Cook County, but for our reputation in the world. Not good when all our papers are in shoe boxes in the back of a closet or in the warehouse, and we want to clean up that reputation. We know it's a difficult time. Is there one last question? I'll pose it. Is there anything we can do to help you?
Yes. Well, what booth people have? They have really good valuation skills and data analysis skills, and they also have a sense of a public spirit and civic responsibility. And so we're always on the lookout for good people. The team that I brought in, basically we're analysts, we're people who are experts, skilled in valuation, but also data scientists, people who are skilled in IT, using mapping systems, and then also people who were skilled managers, who had insights about operations and marketing. All of these things are the kind of people build at Booth. So we're all out for skilled people to join this of, for lack of a better word, nerds, data science nerds, and because that can help us do the job better. We are really blessed to have a good team, but we always want more, and that's one of the ways you can help. And then we are always on the lookout for projects that we can do. Maybe folks out there, either they know current students at Booth or Harris or other places, and we're always on the lookout to bring in good knowledge and insight from students or professors or academia or people from the private sector to identify areas where we could step up our game. Anyone who has insights about real estate valuation or data modeling, using these kinds of factors or mapping, these are all very valuable for us. And that's why one of the reasons why I was tickled to join the group here today.
Well, I didn't want to bury the lead. That's pretty great. That's a great call to action. So where do they get hold of you?
So CookCountyAssessor.com is our website. You can go and read about the system, read about all the different aspects. We're going to be publishing an annual report in just a couple of weeks that sort of gives you a soup to nuts look at the whole system and the different parts of how we're making it work. And I think that's something to look out for. We had a market analyst day. People can go to our website there and learn more about how the system works and what our needs are. My email is fritz@cookcountyassessor.com. So if you want to send me an email, write to me there. We're always happy to talk and engage. And you can always reach us on social media as well, through Twitter or Facebook.
Wonderful. Fritz@cookcountyassessor.com. In case you missed that, that was great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, everyone, for being there. And I hope we can all meet in person on campus sometime soon.
You have an invitation.
All right. I'll be there with bells on.
Okay. Thanks so much.